watching PowerApp Solutions in Minutes. Today we're going to go ahead and build out a very basic plugin to interact with our PowerApps slash Dataverse environment. The purpose of the plugin is going to be that when we create an account, it'll create a task 7 days after the creation of the account. Probably sounds a little familiar, right? But yeah, so we want to kind of use that same theme that we've been using so that things kind of correlate to other videos that we've created together. So let's go ahead and start. So we'll go ahead and open up Visual Studio and then we'll create a new project. And what we want to do is use a class library. And for this project, the class library we're looking for is a good old, probably scrolled right past, didn't I? There it is, class library .NET framework. Make sure it's a C# class library, not Visual Basic. All right, so let's go ahead and hit next here, and then we'll give our project a name, um, basic account plugin, and then I don't want to store this on my main drive. I want to store it here, and we're going to target .NET Framework 4.6.2 instead of 4.7.2 for compatibility. This is one of the most compatible frameworks out there right now. So let's go ahead and create our project. Phenomenal. Okay. All right. So the next thing we're going to do is let's go ahead and rename our class here. It's just called class 1 right now. Let's call it follow-up plugin. And of course, Visual Studio is intuitive enough and smart enough to know that it wants us to rename, or it's recommending to rename all the reference. And absolutely, I agree with that. Let's do it. So now I have follow-up plugin here. The next thing I want to do is I want to implement the interface of iPlugin. But before I can implement that, I actually have to add a NuGet package. So getting a little ahead of myself. So what we'll do is go to our NuGet package manager, and we need to install those core assemblies for Microsoft XRM. So let's browse for some, and let's type in Microsoft.crm, and then we should have some returns here. And here is the Microsoft.crm SDK.core assemblies, 7 million downloads. This is the one we want. So I'm going to go ahead and deploy that and install it. And the latest stable version is perfectly fine. So then the console output will tell us right here if it's installed. So it's doing its thing right now. I think we're in good shape. I'll accept it. Okay, so successfully installed the assemblies. Phenomenal. All right. And then of course we have an error because I haven't implemented iPlugin. So now I want to implement iPlugin. So in order to implement iPlugin, I need to have a using statement up here. So let's do using, and then we're going to do Microsoft.xrm.sdk. And then the other using that I want to be using here is system.serviceModel. Okay. So now that I've done that, I can implement iPlugin. Now, this is a really important step right here. For iPlugin, in order to implement it here in a way that is scalable, if you hit Control Dot, it'll ask you if you want to implement the interface, and I certainly do, because that's going to give me the execute method. So now I have the execute method, and which takes two key parameters, the iService provider and the service provider, and that's going to help us later. And then in here, I'm just going to get rid of this line. Don't really need it right now. And then we're going to build this out together. There's a couple things here that we'll clean up later that we don't really need. But yeah, let's go ahead and get started. So first thing first. Um, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and get the tracing service. So, and that's I tracing service, and we'll call it tracing service is equal to I tracing service. And then service provider dot get service type of, and then we'll pass in iTracing service right back in, and then our semicolon to close it out. All right, and then we'll move on here. Now the next thing we're interested in is, okay, well, we have to get the execution context from the service provider somehow. So let's deal with that as well. So let's put some comments in our code. Best practice, get the execution context from the service provider. And then we're going to say I plug in execution context. And then we'll call that variable context. And then that's where we're going to go ahead and implement I plug in execution context service provider. This probably sounds familiar, right? Very, very similar syntax here. Open parentheses, type of, pass in I plug in execution context, close it out. All right, so now we have our execution context. I like it. All right, so now what we want to do is a check. We want to find out if the input parameters collection that we're working with actually contains all the data that's going to be passed in that message request. So check to see if input params collection has all the data passed in the message request. So it's like a check to do before we do anything, really. And so what we'll do here is now we have an if statement. And just going to be a standard if statement here. We'll build it out like this. And then we're going to say context that we built out earlier dot input parameters contains, and here's where it gets really scalable, target and context dot input params target is an entity. Then let's do stuff. Cool, right? Very good. So we're saying if the input parameters contains the target entity, and if it is an entity, then go ahead and move along. All right. So now let's get the target entity. And the cool thing about getting the target entity is that we can actually use whatever entity we want by using this target notion. We only care about the fact that it is an entity. Where we actually register the plugin and the message step that we register against and the entity we register against is going to define how this target is actually used, right? So think of this as our primary entity. So we're going to get it from the input parameters. And so right here, what we're going to do is we're going to say entity, and then entity equals entity. And then we're going to go ahead and call our context again, and we'll look at our input params and say, all right, well, that's the target that we're looking for. So we have instantiated an entity now. Now this is the table right here. So this is literally this has the context of whatever entity we register against in our plugin registration. This entity var contains the entire table of the entity we're working with. In this case, it's going to be the account. Okay, so we're just associating it to that target based on the context that we've been provided by the iPlugin execution context and the service provider. So moving forward, now we want to go ahead and obtain the org service reference, because without that we can't really make any method calls. So we'll also do that in our if. All right. So here we're going to take our iOrganization service factory and implement our service factory variable. And we're going to say iOrganization service factory. And then once again, service factory now. Similar concept. It's after you do it so many times, um, you just get used to it. So we're going to get the service. I think I may have done a little issue here. Let me see. The service factory and .get service. Yep, that seems right. Ba, 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 ba. Okay. Get service type of, pass in the iOrganization service factory, close it out. Now we have some sort of issue here. It doesn't like this here. And I think the reason it doesn't like it, in fact I know exactly why it doesn't like it, is because our if branch here is inhibiting it from getting out. So let's go ahead and do it this way. So here's our variable, right? And then here we have the iOrganization service factory. And then from here, what we're essentially going to do is, let's remove these for a moment. Let's get them back to where it points back to our namespace. So is this our namespace? This is our namespace. Okay, very good. Now let's try to figure out right here, and this is the stuff you run into when you're writing code ad hoc like this. um, so we have our service. Da, 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 da. Oh, I know where I screwed up. You guys, come on. We have to leverage our service provider, not the service factory here. Service factory. So, service provider.get service, and then what we're going to do next is we're going to go ahead and say, now I want to set up the actual service factory. So, organization service factory, and in this case, it's just the service that I care about, and I just want the service. First one, and then this is going to be the service factory dot create org service, and then here we want to pass in the context and the user ID. Brilliant. All right, very good. Now inside of our if branch, we're going to do a try block. So we'll do a try catch. Let's see if we can't. So we'll do a try. And then this is where all our logic is going to go. So for now, let's just say logic will be here. Let's implement our catch. And what I want to do is do a fault exception based on the organization service fault. Okay. And then I also want to pass that exception there. So in here, in our catch, we'll just throw, I guess, a new invalid plugin execution exception, right? Because we're using a plugin. And then we'll just say an error has occurred in the follow-up plugin. And then we'll go ahead and pass in that exception value, close out our statement there. All right. Now, the other cool thing is that we can go ahead and leverage that tracing service that we initialized so that if anything does go wrong, and it probably will, um, we can essentially capture that exception. So let's go ahead and capture that exception here and then be able to debug this accordingly using that tracing service. So tracing service dot trace, and then we'll just put in this text here. And what we're going to do is for follow-up plugin, this has to be the same name. Follow-up plugin, I want index 0 of that error. Okay, perfect. And then we'll go ahead and pass that to string. Okay, I like it. And I think I may have used the wrong tracing service. Yeah, I totally did. It's just good old tracing service. All right. So now that we have all this in place, what we're going to go ahead and do is build out our logic. So we don't need this logic anymore. What I'm going to put here is create a task activity to follow up with the account in 7 days from the creation of the account. Okay, so let's try this out. So remember, right here, what we got to do is initialize a new entity here, and we have to call that out very specifically. So we'll call it follow-up, and we're going to instantiate a new entity, and we're going to point it right at the task. So this is the schema name of that entity. That's it. That's all we're doing here is just saying, all right, follow-up is equal to task. Very good. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and say, all right, so from the follow-up entity that I have, this whole table that I have access to, just like I do to the account, I'm going to go ahead and tap into the subject, which is a required field, and I'm going to say send an email to the new customer. And close it out. And then once again, I'm going to do something with a description here. So inside this set of brackets, I am essentially tapping into the different schematic field names. They could be custom, right? They could have a prefix like CDX underscore whatever, but these are out of the box fields for a task. That's why I wanted to keep this simple. And then we're going to say for the description, it's going to be equal to, follow up with the customer, check if there are issues that need resolution or sales opportunities. Close that out. I think we should deal with the start and the end. So when is it scheduled for? Because we have to schedule it dynamically here based on the creation date. So what we'll do here is we'll do the schema name of the field for the actual scheduled start is scheduled start. Let's not forget our quotes here. And we're gonna set, now we're gonna do some manipulation of time here. So we'll do a date time and we'll take now. So today, this moment in time when this plugin runs, and then I'm gonna add days. And this kind of probably sounds familiar to when we were doing that Power Automate where we did some add to time. Well, there's an add days expression in Power Automate, but there's also, of course, an add days expression in C Sharp. So we'll add 7 days. So you just pass an integer there, close it out. I like it. And then next thing we'll do is we'll do a scheduled end. We'll do a date time. Dot now. Dot add days. 7. Okay. We'll give it a category. In this case, it's the name of the entity. And it'll make a little more sense once we actually deploy and execute our plugin and test it out. So this is actually going to point to context and the primary entity name. That's it. All right. So then how do we link this thing that we just created, right? We're creating here in memory. How do we link this to the account? Well, we're getting there. All right. So set the regarding of the new task to the newly created account. Okay. So here we'll do some logical checks. It's just going to be a standard if context dot output parameters now contains an ID, right? Meaning, is there actually a ID value? If that's there, let's do stuff. And then here, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and initialize a GUID. We'll call it regarding object ID. Seems fine for now. And then we'll new GUID, pass in context, and the output params. And this is what we'll capture the ID value and pass that to string. So what we're fundamentally doing here is grabbing, in this case, um, the literal ID um, of the account. And the way that we can truly do this is make sure that we initialize a string where we can make sure that the regarding object ID type is equal to the account entity. So what we're saying here is the regarding object ID type is an account. The actual ID is this output param that's coming from our literal plugin execution. And then one of the last things we're going to need to do here before we deal with the actual update or creation, I should say, is we're going to go ahead and say follow up, right? So now we're making another change to our table for our creation of our task. So our follow up, which is synonymous with our task, um, regarding object ID, which is literally a field on that entity, is equal to, and then here's where we got to create a new entity reference. It's the only way we're going to be able to do this. And the entity reference will pass in the regarding object ID type, and we'll pass in the regarding object ID, and then we are golden there. So now that follow-up is pointed to the entity reference that we created here. Okay. From here, what we'll go ahead and do is just move on. And this is where we kind of finalize everything if everything's going well and we haven't run into our catch. uh, so create the task in PowerApps against the newly created account record. So this is pretty straightforward. We're going to leverage a tracing service. We'll trace. And once again, we'll do something like this. Follow up plugin creating the task activity. But here, we'll use the service, that org service that we initialized a while ago, and we're going to it's a create message. And what are we creating? A task, right? Exactly. So we're going to go ahead and pass in follow up. And so when we look through this, what we have is a class that implements iPlugin. In our execute method, which is our primary method for doing anything, we're passing in the iService provider, and then we're also grabbing the tracing service. We're getting the execution context from the service provider. We're performing validation to check to see if we should even move forward and do any of the rest of the work, which is a good idea before we initialize our organization service factory and the actual service itself. And then right here in our try block where our actual logic happens is where we're creating an entity table reference so that we can then store all these values, the subject description, the schedule start, schedule end, category, etc., and be able to then pass them in right here in this create follow-up task. And the beautiful thing about all this is that all of it's going to be connected. So when the account gets created, this plugin is going to run. I plan on registering it asynchronously post operation. So let's go ahead and compile this, see if we get any errors. Nope. All right, so it's compiled. It's sitting in here. So basic account plugin.dll. Okay, very good. And then what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go to our plugin registration tool. And we're going to go ahead and register a new assembly. And then what we'll do is go to our source. And here is our basic plugin account. I'm just going to find out which one is the one I just messed with. It was this one. We're going to go into our bin, our debug, so that we can leverage debugging. And then basic account plugin. All right. Let's choose that DLL. We want to specify the isolation mode. Sandbox default is perfectly fine. We're not on-prem. And then we're going to use database for where the assembly is actually going to be stored, right? Okay, so let's register the plugin. Oh, right. We have to sign it. So let's go back in here. Very important. So what we're going to do is go ahead and right click on our actual project itself, go to properties, and then we're going to go to signing. We're going to assign the assembly, click new. Let's call it my key. I don't really care to give it a password right now. And then I'm going to go ahead and recompile this. And then I'm going to go back in here, register new assembly, grab that new file. You can see it was just modified again. And then I'm going to register the plugin. Okay, so the assembly's been registered, but we have a little bit more work to do. What we want to do is we want to go ahead and create a new step, register a new step, and the step is going to be on the create message. And our primary entity is the account. And then this is a post operation, so it's going to run after we perform the actual event. In this case, the creation of the account has fully been created, and then it's going to be asynchronous. Keep that load off the server, let it run, and then we'll just register this new step. Phenomenal. And then we'll go into our environment. Let's refresh. Not that it really matters because it's the server side, and let's create a new account. We'll call it test basic account plugin create task. We'll save our account. And so it's asynchronous, right? So it's not going to show up in our timeline immediately if this works out. It might take a moment. So let's just refresh our timeline and hope that it actually works. Oh, beautiful. Okay. So here's our task. And let's go ahead and open it up, take a look. Pretty simple, right? I mean, we just have what we passed into the subject, what we passed into the description, the regarding the associated account, and then we have the fact that it's actually due 7 days from today. Um, so that's perfect. That works out. Um, yeah, it looks good. It looks good. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me while we build out our first basic real plugin. And then we're going to start building some much more elaborate ones in later lessons. But this is our first plugin lesson, and I'm very excited to keep making these videos. Yeah, have a great day.